Thank you very much for that intro, Jeff. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for coming and logging into this presentation. I don't think I've ever been accused of hiding my light under a bushel, so I shall try not to do so today. What we'll do today is really about that product that you see on the right side of your screen, our HP-OCT system for optometry and ophthalmology, and really talk about how we got to the point where we have a product just going into the market, and the sort of amazing images and capabilities of that product you can see in that sort of rotating box on the left hand side. You'll see a few of these through the presentation, and that is basically a three-dimensional picture of an eye. So you can see as it spins around, you've got the eyelashes at the top, the cornea at the front, the iris, and the bit through the center of the iris, the pupil, and at the back of the pupil there is what is called a starburst cataract. So that's the sort of diagnostic tools that we are developing. So what we're going to do is to go through this in the way that I always like to think products and opportunities and startups, which is to start with the market, then look at the company that we've structured up the company. We'll talk a little bit about the technology because it's pretty cool, and a bit more about the product, and then we'll try and link that all together in how we went from the concept right through to product in the marketplace. So why optometry? My background's in telecommunications. I worked in telecom for 40 years. Why am I interested in this? Well, it's basically the eye and eye health is an incredibly critical component of overall global health. Something like a third of the population of the planet live with some form of visual impairment, and that about half of those, it's around about 1 billion people, currently have that visual impairment untreated. So there's a huge problem, and if there's a problem, there's a market opportunity as well. Interestingly, and importantly, something like 90% of that impairment is avoidable or treatable. And for us as an initial market opportunity, and one of the major sort of areas of blindness that comes out is from cataracts. You saw in that first slide, that sort of funny darkening of the lens, that's a cataract. And what it does, as it shows on the right there, is it basically stops you focusing properly on the retina when you're looking at something, and the light just gets spread around and diffused, and it's basically you can't see anything. And you can see that in the picture of the body. When there has a strong cataract, grade 3 or grade 4 cataract in his right eye. The great thing about that is it's curable. It's very easy to pop up the damaged lens and replace it with an artificial one. It takes about 20 minutes. The other area that's of considerable interest is myopia, which is short-sightedness. And what we're seeing really is myopia is the largest pandemic there is out there. It is something that is affecting so many people in so many ways, and it's getting worse. It's a problem that has really come to the fore in the last 50 or 60 years. If you looked back 50, 60 years in Southeast Asia, for example, something like 10 to 20% of the population of 20-year-olds are myopic. That's now somewhere over 90% of people in Southeast Asia, 20 years old, are myopic at that age. It's doubled in Europe and Asia, in the US. And there are currently around just 2 billion people globally affected by myopia, and that's predicted to increase to 5 billion people by the middle of the century. Anyway, you may say, okay, well, what's the problem with glasses? Yes, that's true, but myopia itself leads on to a whole range of other eye diseases, particularly people who have severe myopia. And it's now reckoned that myopia is that blindness caused by myopia approaching the same sort of levels as blindness caused by cataracts.
Simon, it's Jeff here. I'll just interrupt for a sec. Your audio is a little choppy. Could I just get you to turn your video off? And that will give a bit more bandwidth for audio.
Yes, let me just try and do that. Just a minute. Yep. Okay. Let's try that and see if we go. If it's not, I'll have to move to another room.
No, that's good.
Fantastic. Now. Thank you. All right, great. So those are what we are looking to do, looking to address, and what we need to be able to do to cure these conditions is to be able to measure the properties of the eye very precisely, which then allows us to put in the correct medical procedures or other processes to allow the diseases to be addressed. For example, for cataract surgery, there are 30 million cataract surgery operations a year. It's the most common form of surgery in the US, but to do this properly, you require extremely precise measurements of the eye, because you've got to select the correct lens that you're going to put in there. You've got to put it in the right orientation, in the right place. And this requires both skill from the surgeon, but also extremely good measurements of exactly what the eye is looking like. And that's, for people who have not seen one before, that's an example of an intraocular lens. You can see in the top left corner there are 3 dots. Those are alignment dots, because this treats both focusing and astigmatism in the eye. For LASIK, again, that's increasingly common procedure, different forms of LASIK, but again, you need very precise measurements to ensure the correct correction. And again, myopia, there are ways of managing myopia, but you require very precise measurements of the size and shape of the eye over a multi-year period, from basically pre-teen through to early 20s, to be able to make sure that you're providing the appropriate medication and or other procedures to sort that out. So that's the market we're addressing. We're a company that started 8 years ago, and this is us standing on a beach. You can tell we're in Melbourne because the beach is a little bit dodgy. That's Steve, co-founder, and my co-founder and CEO. Grant, who's CTO. Trevor, who's our chief scientist, and myself stand in the middle there with a group that started the company back, and I'll talk a bit more about that. There's our VP of engineering. Kylie's head of clinical and commercial. And this guy here is Armin, who is our first employee, German backpacker, who when we were doing the first sort of proof of concept back in 2013, we sort of dragged him off the street. He was living in a van with his girlfriend as they travel around Australia. He's been with us since we started and has been one of the key people within the company. So as I said, we started in 2013, put our first patents in. Patents absolutely critical to our business model to protect what we're doing. I'll talk more about that later. We did the first technology demonstrations a couple of years later. We raised some Series A funding. I'll talk a bit more about funding too as we go through in 2016, and then did our first product release demonstration at a trade show called ARVO, which was in Baltimore in 2018. And at that, we got some very, very strong interest from research groups around the world. And on the basis of that, shipped our first products to them about a year later, which then allows us on the back of that to raise our Series B funding. We achieved ISO 13485 in 2019. Again, I'll talk a bit more about that later. And in the last year, despite the fact that you know, we were struggling, as has everybody, through COVID, we managed to get significant visibility and increasing our visibility as we get towards full product launch. We got Australian made status in the middle of last year. Very important from a marketing perspective, both within Australia, but also seen in Asia as a strong indicator of a quality product. As Jeff mentioned, we did win the Sir William Hudson Award, and I'll talk more about that later. We have now got CE and TGA certification, and we'll talk more about that as we go through. And most recently, we won the Premier's Award in the Victorian Design Awards for the industrial design of our HP-OCT product. So that's all sort of market and background. What is this OCT that we're talking about? OCT, optical coherence tomography, is basically a way of imaging the eye using light. It was invented about 30 years ago by David Huang and a bunch of co-workers, and the first commercial product came out in 1996, a quarter of a century ago now. But to date, it's really been used for imaging the back of the eye, the retina at the back of the eye, because that's a much easier problem to solve. The reflections from the retina are much stronger than they are of any other part of the eye. But there's an increasing demand for this, for imaging the front of the eye, the anterior, what's called the anterior segment, as we talked about earlier, for lens replacement, cataract surgery, or LASIK procedures for vision. And down the bottom, you've got a couple of pictures there. The left one is a retinal OCT. This is just showing the various layers that exist within the retina. And on the right is a sort of a fairly typical anterior segment OCT, I mean, the sort you could see before we started the development here. It's slightly blurry. It's not got huge contrast in there. It's very difficult to get any detailed, and particularly very difficult to get measurements out of that. So why would we want to do another OCT? Well, the problem is with the conventional ways of developing, of using an OTC, you've got very limited performance. The issue is that the eye moves. When you're trying to measure the eye, no matter what you do, there is some eye motion in there. And particularly for the age group for whom these type of issues occur most, which is really people in the older age group, they find it much more difficult to keep their eyes still and to fixate on targets. So it's very hard to get very precise measurements. They have a limited field of view, and as a result of both these, it's actually very, very difficult to get quantitative measurements. And so instead of being able to just use one system like an OCT for getting all the data you needed, you finish up using 4 or 5 different measurement equipment to get the full picture of the eye. What we want to do is to overcome all of those limitations. So with one image capture, you can get all of the data that you need for refractive surgery, for disease screening, for myopia management, what are called scleral lens fitting. We'll talk a little bit about that later. And basically overcome all of that. And I mentioned David Huang earlier, who invented the OCT back in 1991. Well, he has actually taken a look at what we're doing, and he basically thinks this is the best OCT that he's seen for many, many years, which is a great endorsement from somebody who basically invented it. How does our HP-OCT work? And why is it called HP-OCT? Well, in a traditional OCT, what you do is you take a single beam of light from a laser and you scan it across the eye in a raster pattern. I'm only showing a single scan here. It's hard to create the pictures in PowerPoint otherwise. And as you scan across the eye, you measure the profile of the eye at different points. And this is looking at the front of the eye, so we're measuring across the cornea at the front of the eye, just looking at the front of the eye. What we do is, instead of a single spot, we have 1,000 beams. We take the light and split it up into 1,000 individual beams, which all image on the eye at the same time. So what we're doing is we're effectively taking a snapshot of the eye, and we do that 300 times a second. So every 3 milliseconds or so, we get a complete snapshot picture of the eye. What that does is it allows us, with that very short measurement acquisition time, we overcome this patient eye movement limitation. And because it's a very fast measure, we're doing parallel data acquisition rather than serial, we can be much faster than any other systems out there, somewhere between 10 times faster, which allows us to acquire more data. So we can acquire data over a larger area, and we can automate a whole bunch of the data acquisition processes. And it's called HP. It stands for hyperparallel because we are using a very large number of parallel beams being measured at once. So what we'll see here is this is just a little video which is going to show how the system works in practice. So we'll just start that up, and we have an automatic alignment of the system with the patient. It finds the eye. Built into there is a whole bunch of cameras to automatically align. And then we start to fire these arrays of dots at the eye. And we, as you can see in the left-hand inset, we dither it very slightly to fill in the gaps between each of the beams, which allows us to get a very, very high-resolution image from which we can extrapolate all of the critical parameters that are needed to be able to characterize the eye. And here I'm going to show a typical image. This is what we're looking at here is actually a montage of four images. The one on the top right is the three-dimensional image. And what I'm going to show is a video of basically that rotating and then looking at different scans through that, pick up the other images. The one on the top left is the transverse image, so that's a line horizontally through the eye. The one below that is a line vertically, and the one on the bottom right is an en face, so it's a plane going through the eye in the Z direction. So that'll become clearer as I run this. You can see there the incredible detail that we've got. And if you look just at the top of the eye, there, just above that bright spot on the right, there's a mark there. That's actually a problem with a LASIK surgery. The eye has grown back wrong, and it's actually causing some vision problems for this person. Now this is just rotating. You can see the incredible detail that we're getting there. And now plane is running through, and the image on the left is detail at that plane at each point. This is just post-processing. We can set up those planes wherever we want. Now we're going from left to right, or right to left in this case. You can see the various features of the eye coming in. And this last one is we're going down in the Z direction, moving down through the eye. And that's the outset of the cornea. There's the iris. We're now going down into the lenses side. And all that data is collected in 1 second. And we can take that and we can basically, that comes in a full volume. We can then take that and extract from that all the measurements and detailed information that we need. Now, for people who've been through this seminar series before, they might well have seen this slide. This is what Tim Kanagaita presented a couple of weeks ago, looking at the progression of a company from the start at the left-hand side, where you have product concept, through to transitioning to device supply on the right-hand side. And you see there's an awful lot in there. I'm not going to try and cover this. A lot of this has been covered in individual seminars over the last few months. I'm going to try and pick up on some of these points and show you how we manage that with Cylite. So we are at this point. We're really, we've got the development done. We've got some of our certification in place. We're now in the process of taking the product fully into market and going through all of the growth pains and execution pains that involves. And I started off pretty much talking about the people in the company, and I think that's a critical thing when you're thinking about growing a company, is to realize your limitations. When we started this company back in 2013, we had the core skill set that I think we needed for starting a development like this. We had optics design, we had domain expertise coming from Grant, who also had a lot of software knowledge. Trevor came out of a machine learning algorithmic background. We'd need that to be able to extract all the data we wanted. And my background, whilst I started off as a technology sort of guy, much more now marketing, biz dev type of guy. So that's what we started with. And then in 2017, after we'd done the initial sort of proofs of concepts and started to build out the engineering team, we had to bring in engineering management. And so we brought in Andy Parkinson to be our engineering manager. He's now VP engineering. We also then, as we went through the process, had to build out our regulatory and quality capabilities. All the way through this, we were working with an ISO 13485. We'll talk more about that in the next couple of slides. But bringing in an experienced quality manager through MENA and an experienced regulatory manager to help us get through the paperwork nightmare that is the regulatory process. Brought those in 2019. And then last year, as we're starting to get closer to market, bring in Kylie Hall, who is formerly with Zeiss, bringing our domain-specific sales and marketing, bring in financial controller, because, you know, as the company grows and we get closer to market, managing finances gets harder, but you don't want to spend that money up front unless you have to. Most recently brought in Simon Davis to run operations and to scale that. Simon's got experience in building factories in China, and working within Finisar here in Australia as well. It's about growing the team at the right time for the right stage in what you're doing. And I'd sort of just bring up 3 key inflection points when you're thinking about this. The first one is when you get to about 10 people in the company. Up to that point, everybody knows what everybody is doing at all times. At 10 points, you start 10 people or so, you have to start to accept the fact that you don't know what everybody's doing at all the time. And at somewhere between 30 and 50 people, you have to start creating that sort of, you can call it siloed, call it departmental, call it what you like. You have to break up into smaller groups again, which then have to run into coordination. You still know who everybody in the company is. You still know roughly what they're working on, but you don't know you know, the details of where they're at. And then somewhere around 100 people, you get to the point where you may not even recognize some of the people in the company unless you're part of the people, one of the people who hired them, and you certainly don't know what everybody's doing. You can try to learn all that, but it's very hard to do so if you're a senior manager within the company. So Cylite is currently at the 50-person level. We're just going through that inflection, and we're really starting to build out a lot of our back office systems, as well as sort of looking at the at making sure we've got the right structure and people in place to take us forward. I mentioned right at the start that intellectual property is a key thing for us. In fact, our third hire of IP counsel. So we hired a patent lawyer as our third member of staff. I mentioned we filed our first patent 6 months after, and we now have a large family of patents covering many aspects of our product design and future product design. What we don't do is we don't file all of our patents in Australia. We see that the critical areas for patents will depend upon which market we're going to, which countries we see are likely to be patent battle areas, so on. The recent changes in the announcement of budget regarding a patent box may change our view of patenting in Australia, as there are now tax advantages for filing patents and maintaining them in Australia. Previously there wasn't. Must emphasize the importance of trade secrets. Not everything should be patented. I really believe, and I'm prepared to sort of stand on this one and shout from my high horse, that the majority of, for instance, process patents should never be filed. They should be kept as trade secrets. And the patents are really about use and application rather than how you make something. Everybody thinks about patents. Yes, we've got something that nobody else has done. We've got something that nobody else has used. But the other critical part of this is making sure you have freedom to operate. That is, understand the patent landscape that surrounds you, and that you're not treading on other people's toes who could then come back and bite you. Also be very careful when you're looking at patents out there. Don't put everything in writing. Those can also come back and bite you. I've been involved in patent litigation for over 30 years now, and just be really careful what you put in writing about other people's patents. And don't forget trademarks. Trademarks are important, and you don't want anybody passing something off as yours using your name. If you've trademarked it, that helps. I was asked to talk a little bit about funding. I don't think funding is the hardest thing. I think there are, these days, many of these funding sources for people who've got a realistic business model and a realistic opportunity. Now we can, again, I'm quite prepared to have a discussion on that in the question time. I think that I'm going to look at the things that here that Cylite's used. Investment capital is external finance. Yes, very much. There's a lot more VC funding around now than there has been for a long time in Australia. There's some great funds out there that, you know, some who specialise in medical. These all need to have an appropriate business model, pitch, understanding of the market, and so on. So, you know, it behooves you to, anybody who's trying to do this, to really get on top of that. We went through this in Cylite. We did 3 funding rounds. We did a seed round in April when we started the company. That was a combination of management kicking in some money to be able to hire our first employees, but also sweat equity from all the management team. We all pretty much worked for the first 2 or 3 years, either part-time or yeah, mostly part-time, and basically for nothing. We raised a Series A in October 2016. This was an investment by the management team, plus a whole bunch of private investors, a mix from the US and Australia. And then in May 2019, we went to our Series B with Main Sequence leading that round, plus all of our Series A investors doubling down on this. We've used a lot of government grants. Government grants are extremely good value. They're non-dilutive funding. It generally requires some form of matching funding, so you have to have some funding somewhere to match to most of these. We've used accelerating commercialization, EMDG. We've done international linkages to provide some of our linkages with our research teams overseas. There's funding for interns. There are all sorts of government grants available. Please avail yourself of them. And R&D tax rate is a really critical one as well. You know, basically, if you're not making a profit and your turnover less than 20 million, you will get a big chunk of your R&D expenditure back from the government in cash the following year. And there are even ways to factor that. There are companies out there that will basically lend you the money in advance of you getting it back from the government. Really important, but I don't believe that the funding is the hardest part here, not anymore. So quality and certification, ISO 13485, you have to have that, and it requires a lot of very hard, detailed work because it covers everything that you do. From Cylite, we built our own system from the ground up, based on Confluence and Jira, which are 2 Atlassian products. I don't have time to take you into that, but it is enormous. It links into all of our production, all of our development activities, and 1385 is just the must-have for anybody in the medical space. We built our own because we knew that we would have to be putting our own manufacturing and so on, and do all our own development in-house. So we needed to be able to put those within the 13485 system, and there was nothing that really maps onto the sort of product that we were building here. Certification, we're a type 2A certified device, so we have to go through a bunch of clinical trials and safety trials and so on. It's not a self-certification. So the route that we went down was to go for CE, which then gives us effectively Australian, New Zealand TGA, and then later go for FDA. We had a slight problem. Brexit came along. We had signed up with SI as our notifying body, and when Brexit came, BSI being based in the UK, were going to be cut out of being a notifying body for the EU, so they had to scramble to relocate everything into Europe for their medical side of things. Caused us some heartburn, but we did get that at the end of last year. Now, of course, the EU is transitioning to MDR, and we have to now go through another certification in there. Really interesting in that one is that there's now cybersecurity requirements within the certification that weren't there previously. And cybersecurity is an increasing issue for everybody. I'd make a shout out here for ISO 27001 as the data security certification. It's going to be part of everybody's life going forward. If you haven't started thinking about it, you need to. And it's another one of those horrible certifications. It takes probably about 1.5 years to get through on my current model. So engineering, we've got to comply with ISO 13485. Our product has a lot of optics in it. It's an optomechanical product at its core, with a lot of electronics around it. It's got firmware in it. It's got some serious software running on basically top-of-the-line PCs with video game cards for the GPUs to do the graphics processing. Critical in that is design for manufacture. And I think everybody will go through at least one iteration of a product where the design for manufacture isn't perfect. That's part of the deal. Configuration management is really important in all of this, and putting in place a configuration management system. Again, we use Atlassian for our configuration management built into our ISO 13485. And also understanding the impact of cybersecurity requirements. So we've got a complex one. We mentioned earlier that we did win the Sir William Hudson Award. The engineering in this is pretty phenomenal. The William Hudson Award goes across all engineering. It's not just products. It covers things like the new port that was built up in the top end of Western Australia, which is $1 billion port that was built up there. It was one of the competitors we had in this. It covers bridges, it covers roads, it covers buildings, and then we as a basically an optomechanical company beat all those with our HP-OCT last year. Very, very chuffed with that. I want to talk a bit about industrial design. It's something that's often overlooked, but as I'm sure Jeff and anybody else involved in this space for a while will know, industrial design is really important. So we started off with benchtop proofs of concept, and there's a couple of the sort of early rigs that we put together to try things out. Lots of optics, electronics hanging out the back of it, all sorts of horrendous stuff. We then had to crunch that down into our alpha prototype, and this is the alpha prototype that we built. So inside that aluminium chassis on the right, it looks like aluminium, it's actually stainless steel. There's all of the optics built into that and arranged vertically, and hanging out the back of it that you can't see here is an enormous rack with lots of electronics in it. And that then has to come down into something like this, which is our final product. So I'm just going to walk very quickly through this as what you do. So here's how we went through this. We did this with a company called Cobalt, based down in Melbourne, where Cylite is based. And we start off with a very sort of simple concept of, a block concept of this is what we think this can look like. And then you go, okay, well, what have we got to fit into this? There's all of the motors in the base, there's the optics, there's all electronics, the patient's got to fit in there somewhere. And you finish up with this very blocky sort of idea, which is sort of like the first phase of how this is all going to work. Then you bring in the guys who really understand design, and you come up with starting to make this look like a real product and not like something out of an engineer's nightmare. And here's just a few of the concept sketches that we worked through with Cobalt over this period. And this took 6 to 9 months to go through this whole process of how we get the patient in front of it in the right place, what it looks like, how the lines work, trying to make this distinctive and appropriate for the market that we're addressing. And then you come through the design, and then you have to go through the process of actually building all of the parts that go into this, designing the moldings, the plastic moldings that go around there, how it fits together, all the screws, all the clips, colors, a huge amount of mechanical design work, and also patient testing, human factors testing of how this all works from a manufacturing perspective, how it works from a patient perspective, and how it works from a clinician perspective. And you finish up with something that looks like this, which is a beautiful, sleek piece of instrument, which is very different from anybody else's. You can see in the right-hand side there, you've got what is effectively a camera lens in the middle. There are two smaller cameras either side, just below the horizontal there, that are used for positioning the patient. We have illumination all the way around it for illuminating the eye in different ways. Now, the choice of materials for the headrest and so on, all of this is part of the industrial design, really critical. And as I said earlier, we won the Victorian Design Award Premier's Prize earlier this year, I think in March this year. We're now in the running for the National Prize. We'll see how we go with that one. But it's been really important. It's been, in terms of our interaction with the market, people have sort of recognised this as a very different way of building an OCT. Pretty much last but not quite least, manufacturing. We build our own product. We own the processes, we control the processes. We have a factory in Notting Hill down in Melbourne. The main assemblies we saw is a complex optomechanical build. We use in-house assembly and alignment of all those optics and motors and everything else within a class 100K clean room. This is the clean room fairly early on in its development. There are, either side of that walkway there are basically assembly stations which are separate and which each have their own individual HEPA filters to give us an even higher level of cleanliness where we're doing the assembly. And we have to build all of our own manufacturing, test and calibration equipment. You can't go out and buy a system that will align and test what you want to test to the position that we need to. That's looking at one of them from a distance. There's no material in there for actually building anything. And here's a close-up of that. And what you see in there is you've got the two gantries on the left and on the right, which are a combination of imaging gantries, so we have cameras attached to them, and also placement, so we can place components in the right place. And as we go forward, that becomes increasingly automated. And the bit in the middle, that's sort of what looks like an octagonal block. That's the base plate that we build the optics on. You can see on there are some of those optics already in place. And that's a process that's continuing under development. We're continuing to improve and upgrade our manufacturing in that way. We have a global supply chain. We do purchase out of Australia where it makes sense. We have a lot coming down out of Asia, but we also purchase out of the US and Europe. We have to do this to get the quality that we need, the price that we need. And it's like an inverse sales organization. You know, when you have a sales team, you have to get them onto airplanes and go out and visit customers. Here we have a supply team that has to go out onto airplanes and visit suppliers, particularly given the current problems that exist globally in the supply chain due to the sort of ending of the COVID pandemic. We're seeing major issues in doing that, so we're working very hard to make sure we're not impacted by any of those supply chain problems. Once we've built that optical assembly, that's then combined with a whole bunch of PCBAs. I think there are 9 actual PCBAs in the instrument, which are all interconnected and talk to one another, all of which have some form of processor running, some embedded firmware. Along with motors, that gets assembled up into the housing. Then we do the burn-in and calibration and test prior to shipping. And again, this configuration management and the handling of ECN's engineering change notices and making sure they're processed properly so that production is handling the right version, everything, the right processes, and managing all of that in the production environment, absolutely critical. Okay, so the last part of the journey, it's not the last part, but it's the part that we're focusing on right now, is taking the product to the market. This in itself is multiple presentations, so I'm going to do in under 3 minutes what usually takes about 2 hours of talking through the marketing process. Basically, it's about getting visibility at the right places at the right time. We started off our marketing back in 2016 at an optics technical show We wanted to try out the technology on people. And it wasn't until 2018, another 2 years later, that we actually went to an optometry and ophthalmology show, again focused on the requirements of researchers, because what we want is we want researchers to go, wow, this is great, yes, I can use this, I can create good papers on it, to generate what we call podium presence. They get people who are talking to their peers about the great things that our system does. And KOLs, key opinion leaders, another part of that. We're sort of moving through that now, and we're building on that. We've found that LinkedIn is a very good and relatively cheap. We don't advertise, we just work hard on building our followers and our rep on LinkedIn. We do advertising. The first advert is coming out next month, in a few weeks' time. And I'll show you that now. This is the basically the first time we're going to be coming out in public and telling people what we're doing. And this comes out in Australian journals, say, in about a week's time. But it's expensive. I'm amazed at how expensive advertising is, but in the industry we're in, it's actually a critical part of it, both in terms of print and online. Also very important to get your website done and get a good CRM, customer relationship management system in place, so you are talking to your customers in the right manner at the right time in the right way. That's all the marketing side of things. Then we come into the sales side, and it's really the usual questions. Do you do direct, or do you do via some form of distribution? For us, it'll be a hybrid model. We'll do some direct, we will do some distribution. The difficulty with COVID is direct sales is very hard to manage unless your people are permanently based overseas. You can't do fly-in, fly-outs at the moment. So building up distribution is increasingly important, and supporting it remotely. So before we finish, and I've got two more, I want to talk a little bit about what's coming down the track. We've looked so far just at simple imaging of the eye. I haven't really talked about the measures we can do, excuse me, but we can measure all of the properties of the eye. Looking down the track, one of the really interesting things about the eye is that it gives you a visibility into what's going on in the rest of the body. It's the only place where you can really see what's going on in blood vessels that feed the retina. You can also see those blood vessels in the front of the eye, with a thing called angiography. And it was interesting, and I didn't realize this, but a friend of mine I found recently had a leukemia diagnosis about 25, 30 years ago. And the diagnosis was made from the image, a photograph of the retina of his eye and the blood vessels, what's happening in the blood vessels. So there's a huge amount of interest in looking at basically using the eye as a way of measuring blood flow. And this has been around for a while now in the retinal space. And what we're able to do now is to generate images of blood vessels in the anterior segment, in the cornea and the iris. And that's what you see here. This is a false color picture. The orangey yellow are the blood vessels that we are able to measure because we have such precise measurement within the front of the eye. Again, the left and right motion there. And the one at the bottom is just the en face again, looking at the front of the eye. You can actually see the blood vessels in there. The other thing you can see in the eye is you can actually see brain cells at the rear of the eye. And this is incredibly interesting. The optic nerve is an extension of the brain, and it's affected in the same way as the brain cells are by things like the proteins, the amyloid beta proteins and the tau proteins that are associated with Parkinson's and with Alzheimer's and so on. So there's a really interesting opening just there. And then finally, this is some very latest stuff we just published this week, which is looking at ultra-wide imaging. For many myopia applications, use a thing called a scleral lens, which you put over the eye. It's a hard lens, and what it does is it bends the eye back into shape whilst it's on top of the eye. But you need to be able to fit it very well. There's also a company called Mojo in the US who are developing a contact lens version of a Google Glass, which has to fit very well onto the eye. This would be a great technology for those sort of guys to be able to see how well their thing is fitting. So we hold the eye open here with a pair of retractors. So it's literally pulling the eyelids apart so you can see that right down into the eye, and we can see right across the eye, the whole width of the eye from left to right, and also from top to bottom, as we'll see in the bottom left there. Literally, we can see everything in the eye all the way around. There's a whole bunch of other clinical applications of this capability, which we're really excited about. And it's only possible because of this volume catch we have, gives you incredibly precise and accurate images, which you can then pull out measurement data from. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. And I think, Jeff, you want to take the questions now?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Thank you for an absolutely fascinating presentation. And it's really good to see someone going down this journey from scratch through to having a product ready for volume manufacture on the market, and through all its regulatory compliance stuff and all of the quality system stuff along the way. So we've got a few questions come in, but I'm going to ask a loaded question first. Knowing what you know now, what is the single most important or useful bit of information or advice you wish you'd been given along the way?
Well, if I can answer that in the most general sense, the most important thing, I think, is understanding cash management in a company. In certainly my very first company, we nearly went broke several times, and the difficulty of making that, and particularly in the growth phase. When you're going through a growth phase, you're having to build things, pay for your materials well ahead of when you're getting your receipts, which may be net 30, or you're dealing with a big company net 90 days after you ship. And that cash gap there can just kill you. If I'd known how hard that was at the start, I'd have done things very differently. Luckily, I've sort of think I've learned that, and now we just worry about it rather than panic about it.
Fair enough. Question from Harry: can you also measure the posterior corneal astigmatism?
Yeah, we can measure basically we can do topography or pachymetry. So we can do both anterior and posterior corneal topography, and therefore pachymetry. Yes, so the answer to your question is yes. We can effectively measure every optical surface within the eye within the same measurement. That's the really interesting thing, is starting to look at that now and bring all of those in, as some of the latest, like the Barrett True K formula, I think it is starting to bring some of that in terms of the calculation formula used for IOLs.
I have an anonymous question. Can you please give a practical example of what a project might decide to keep as a trade secret versus including in the patent?
Sure. You know, an example of that would be you've got to align, say, 3 different optical components in a particular way to get a certain optical transfer function between them. These components would need to be aligned to submicron accuracy, and you develop a way of doing this in terms of you do the first one, and the third one, then the second one, and that gives you the accuracy that you need. If you then go and patent that, you say you have to do the first and the third, then the second, but that you think is stopping people using that particular approach. That doesn't work, because all they need to do is to make one minor change to the way you do things. In this case, do the second, then the third, then they've overcome your patent. Anything that basically you can overcome a patent by just making a small change to it that changes the workflow in a process or something like that, it will basically give you a way around somebody else, a way around your patent. And if that's critical to how you build something, you don't want to put that out there.
Okay, question from Glenn Downey. Hi Simon, thanks for the presentation. Could you please speak to the early prototyping given the specialist optical needs? Did you have to go offshore, e.g. JPEX, to access prototyping facilities required? What is the hindrance that these facilities are not available locally?
Thanks, Glenn. Nice to hear from you. So for the prototyping, what we did in this case, it's a mix, because there is the optical prototyping, which, as you saw, we tend to do on sort of big optical benches. And then what we've done a lot of, and then, you know, it seems like every month there's yet another request from engineering for us to buy yet another 3D printer. This one with a certain capacity, with a slightly more precise than the last one we bought last month. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant. So the prototyping, for example, for electronics, we're doing mostly that within Australia. There's good prototype electronics capability within Australia. We're very aware, though, of the need at some point to go to volume and making sure that we have the best supply chain there. So we're still working with Australian companies, but we're also aware of the need potentially to move some of that offshore, depending on volumes and costs. In terms of the mechanicals, we use once we get beyond, you know, the 3D printing, I've used for many years fast turnaround machine shops in Southeast Asia, particularly Malaysia. There's some great prototyping capability up in there, strangely enough. Which they also have the capability for medium volume at reasonable prices. So we do our prototyping where makes sense. We do some in-house. We don't really have a machine shop, we just have 3D printers. We do use local where we can. For the optics, there isn't really a local optics industry. We have to do all our prototyping overseas. For instance, the optics elements that generate those 1,000 beams, there's really only 3 manufacturers of those globally, a couple in Europe, no, 1 in Europe and 2 in the US. So, you know, we have to work with those guys to prototype what we need there. That's the answer, Glenn, is a bit of a mix, and it's really part specific. There's no simple one outcome here.
I'll just put a little bit of a Oh, hang on, I'm getting echo there. A little bit of a plug for the local electronics capability with Circuitwise. Have had a couple of projects where they've actually beaten offshoring for price for highly automated assembly optimized designs, and particularly for medical. So for anyone who needs electronics prototyping work done, don't discount the local options, Circuitwise, and there are others. Certainly the capability is there.
Certainly for electronics, there's a lot of good capability locally. It's when you get to very high volumes, it's not always sure where that lies, and I think it changes regularly. I think, you know, things like Circuitwise and people like SRX down in Melbourne are doing. You know, there's capability to grow there.
Yep, absolutely. Couple of questions from Serge Pirash. First question: can you do corneal epithelial mapping?
Yes.
Mapping.
Corneal epithelial mapping. Yes. The epithelium is basically a very thin layer at the top, on top of the cornea, a few microns thick, and it provides, you know, basically the sort of the top layer of the cornea. And yes, we can. That's part of will be part of our first official release software when that comes out later this year.
And second question: what is your optical digital resolution?
Okay, now that depends on what you're measuring, and I'm just going to look up the number, which I have here somewhere, because I always get confused as to what the number is in. He says looking for the right piece of paper. So I think it is somewhere around about a 5 micron transverse resolution of the cornea, and about 9 micron deep. I haven't got the actual numbers here in front of me, and I just want to make sure that I've got those correct. I can't find the folder with those numbers in. I'm sorry. If you want to drop me a line, I can dig those out for you. The numbers are on the website on the data sheet that's there.
A couple of questions from Matt Sheedy. Hi Simon, great presentation. Question 1, if it's not a secret, how do you go about achieving 1,000 laser dot point array. I assume the system does not use 1,000 individual lasers emitters and using some form of spinning mirrors or a series of beam splitters.
Yeah, Matt, hi again. The answer to that is actually we took a technology called a micro lens array, which we've worked with in the telecom space. That's basically, it's like a plain sheet of glass with a whole series of very small lenses imprinted upon it. And you can imprint, you know, whatever pattern of lenses you want on that. And then by illuminating that with a single broad beam, you generate as many output spots as there are micro lenses on there. And that's how we do it. That's out there in the public domain, it's patented, and it's one of the really key optical developments we have, is pulling this, say, these component concepts out from the telecom space into the medical space.
I just seen on the chat box coming from Serge, if you're considering working with distributors in Europe, I can offer my services, etc. Just to Serge, if you would like to give a presentation on the sort of capability you can offer in Europe, that would be more than welcome to present via webinar by this community. We're not constrained with this community about people presenting with a commercial flavour. In fact, we encourage that because that's part of the information resource that we're trying to provide by this community to sort of grow the pie and make it better for everybody. Second question from Matt. How did you and your team in the early days work out your regulatory pathway for each region? Then how well was that executed? What insight lessons did your team gain from achieving regulatory compliance in each of the regions?
Oh, thanks, Matt. Spoken as a true member of the regulatory compliance team. The way we went about this was basically looking that we wanted to be able to launch into a reasonable sized market. Australia is a small market relatively, so we wanted certification that we could easily address a reasonable market, and CE was that certification. It's also an easier certification than FDA. Particularly these days, FDA has become very difficult to do what's called a 510K, which is certifying via similarity with other products. They're putting a lot more hurdles in terms of the number of instruments you've got to compare against. So we went for CE, particularly MDD, because that was a relatively simple. We had to prove efficacy and capability within a limited range. It also then gives you access to the Australian and New Zealand markets, which we wanted because they're our home markets. That we want to support those. They're good for doing a lot of early sales into. And CE also gets into a number of other markets globally. They're basically people who line up with a CE style of regulation, and there are those that line up with FDA. And so we pushed FDA out. Also, the fact that CE MDD was coming to an end meant that we wanted to get in under MDD so we could at least start selling as soon as possible, knowing that MDR was going to be a much harder ask than MDD. And we're just going through that transition phase now, going from MDD to MDR. The learning I'd have from it is that it's hard. It's damn hard. That's probably the best way to, and it requires everybody in the company to commit to it. It really does.
The thing I find sort of particularly confusing and misleading is that you look at the different jurisdictions and they have their own nomenclature and methods for basically saying the same thing. They're really all saying comply with ISO 13485 and the globally recognized standards that apply to your particular device, but they say it in different ways and with different means of presenting that information and different jargon, and it just gets incredibly confusing. And so the challenge from my point of view is coming down to a standardized baseline of documentation deliverables that satisfy everybody, but then just presenting them in the different formats that different jurisdictions require. So it is a challenge.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually, Jeff. Very good point. It is, and that's why we brought on a regulatory guy who'd been through this many times. He used to be with LX, who'd been through things with them. So he brought a huge amount of know what you really have to do versus what you think you have to do, in terms of filling in filling the blanks in on those different applications.
And so I insist that within Genesis that we use nomenclature that links to ISO 13485. Then we have cross correlation of that with the nomenclature that you find in TGA and FDA and CE and whatnot, rather than people using terminology from one jurisdiction as if it's the gospel. A question from Luke Sires, also Matt's a Genesis employee, I might say. Luke Sires, also from Genesis, being one of the few medical device companies here in Australia, what has been the key advantage of doing R&D and even manufacturing here?
For us, the key advantage in R&D is that we have a very high skill capability in this area. Not in every area that we'd like. There are good people in the optics and electronics space here. We're relatively cheap compared to doing it in the US or in main countries in Europe. And also we have a network here. You know, Steve Friskin and myself have been doing startups in the optoelectronic space for 30 odd years. And we know who's who in the zoo and can pull people in as and when we need them. The other thing that's really good here is the support that we get from the government. The R&D tax rebate is fantastic. The accelerating commercialization, start grants, whatever you want to call them these days, all of that capability is really good. And there are within Australia, you know, companies like yourselves, CircuitWise and so on, who can support the smaller companies in this space. So, Cylite is 50 people now. We're going to grow that significantly over the next year. You know, we're almost a medium-sized company. I think we're small, but in Australian standards, we're almost medium-sized. And you know, there is a capability to do that. Plus, from a qualification and certification perspective in clinical trials, we've got a fantastically heterogeneous population here. That means we can pretty much within Australia trial against any particular sort of national group that we need to, without having to work, you know, within other countries globally.
Okay, so we're just a little bit over time, but we've got one more question left. Serge is once again stretching the boundaries of my knowledge of nomenclature in the space. Are you considering calculations for toric IOLs and the post-refractive patients?
Yeah, so yeah, for toric IOLs and post-refractives, yes. Well, that's one of the things that we're really interested in, because we're measuring all of the optical surfaces very, very precisely. We can actually pick up all of the information needed for toric implantation. A toric IOL is one that overcomes astigmatism. So not you just correct for your refractive vision, you correct for your astigmatism as well when you have one of these put in. So you finish up getting better vision you probably had in your life when you get a toric IOL in. And so, yes, absolutely. It's because we have this real precision. We believe that it's these high-end IOLs, torics, multifocals, and so on, that are where our core business and market's going to be in there. And then, of course, we have to generate all of the various fudge factors that are required to map up with other people's measurements, shall we say. There's a whole bunch of dark arts in there that I don't really want to go into here, but I'm happy to have a chat with people about. To make sure that we align with what people expect, which is not necessarily what is optically correct.